Hi everyone, and welcome to House of Vining. My name is Ivy, and today I'm coming to you with my first official sewing project tutorial. We'll be creating this cool little crop top, complete with a collar, cutout section at the midriff, 2 different waistband options, and an exposed zipper at the back. This pattern is available for purchase in my House of Vining pattern boutique if you'd like to sew along with me and create the same thing. But a lot of the techniques I'll be covering can be applied to many different sewing projects as well. I'd love to hear from you all about what kinds of projects or techniques you'd like to see tutorials on in the future. So if you have any suggestions, just leave a comment below. I've gathered all of my notions, which you can find a complete list of in the pattern instructions. I've also gone ahead and cut out all of my fabric pieces, as well as marked all of my drill holes with tailor tacks, so I'm ready to roll. If you have any questions about the cutting and marking process, I highly recommend checking out my video on cutting sewing patterns, which will tell you everything you need to know to get your project prepared up to this point. Aside from the pattern pieces that must be cut from interfacing, all of the other pieces in the pattern are designated as needing to be cut from self in the pattern info. But you may see that I've gone ahead and elected to cut my collar out of a contrast fabric, which you're more than welcome to do as well. Or perhaps you want to cut your waistband out of contrast or color block the panels in the bodice. Be creative with your fabric choices. The fabric that I'm working with today is a cotton sateen, which is one of my go-to basics because it's really easy to sew and also has just a little bit of stretch that gives some added comfort to otherwise structured garments. This pattern contains 2 different waistband options, so you only have to cut the front waistband pieces for the style that you've chosen. Option A has some hardware accents, and option B is a continuous waistband without hardware. The back waistband pieces are the same, regardless of which style you've chosen. I'll be making my main garment with option A today, but I'll also be including the sewing procedures for option B when we reach that point in the project. Also, if you prefer to make this top without the collar, you can simply omit it and finish your neckline with just the facings. To begin, we'll want to fuse our inner facings to the wrong side of their corresponding fabric pieces. You'll see that I have a few different types of interfacings going on today. My go-to interfacing is a type called weft. So I used white weft for the collar pieces because my collar is going to be made out of white fabric, and I cut this sort of gray-black weft for the waistband pieces. However, after cutting the waistband interfacings, I ran out of this dark-colored weft. So I just went and grabbed some tricot interfacing that I had to use for the facings because it'll work just as well. All of the interfacing pieces are 1/8 of an inch smaller than the fabric pieces that they get fused to. So just center them on the piece with the bumpy side, which is the glue side, against the wrong side of your fabric. I like to use muslin as a press cloth to keep my iron plate clean. To begin our sewing, I'm going to start with the front princess seams. So laid out on the table, I have my center front panel and my 2 side front panels. As you take a look at the princess seams, which are right here, you'll see that there's 3 notches running along the side front and center front panels on both sides. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Within that area, from the lower notch to the upper one, is a little bit of excess, as in the side front panel is made slightly longer than the center front panel within that area. From the upper notch to the top of the seam, they're the same length. From the lower notch to the bottom of the seam, they're the same length. But in this area in the middle, which goes right over the bust curve, that's where our excess lies. And we want to do a little technique now to help us take that excess and ease it inward so that it will fit into the space that we're given on the center front panel a little bit better. We're going to accomplish this by doing ease stitching along our 2 side front panels. Ease stitching is sewn exactly the same as gathering stitches. We'll be stitching 2 rows with a long stitch length, no back stitching at either end, and we're leaving long thread tails at both ends of the stitch lines because we need to grab those threads and pull on them to help draw the fabric inward a little bit. Now, when I say that they're like gathering stitches, they're sewn exactly the same, but the amount of excess we have is a lot less than when you're actually trying to create gathers. So when we draw this excess inward, we don't want to actually create physical folds. We just want to sort of coerce it inward a little bit. So I'm going to take my 2 side front panels over to the sewing machine and sew 2 rows of stitches on each one, from the lower notch past the middle notch to the upper notch. We'll be sewing those 2 rows at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm using a 4mm stitch length for my ease stitching and leaving about 6 inches of thread tails at both ends of each row. My machine's throat plate doesn't have a line for 3/8, so I'm just eyeballing it between the 1/4 and 1/2 inch lines. Next, I'm going to pin my side front to my center front panel along the princess seam with the right sides together. So I always like to start by laying everything out with the right side facing up, and then you can just take each piece and flip it down when it's time to pin, and that will result in the right sides being together. So I'll start that with this one side first. We'll just take the other piece and scoot it out of the way till we're ready. To pin the princess seam now, we want to start by matching the beginning and end points of our seam first with our pins. Then we'll pin any notches, and once the notches are pinned, we'll be pulling that thread to draw our ease stitch inward. I'm going to start with this lower section and grab just the 2 threads on the top of my ease stitches, not the ones underneath. I'll hold on to them, pinch the fabric, and pull. You can already see it's starting to sort of scoot a little excess fabric into that area. Okay, once I have my excess drawn inward, now I'll continue with more pins. So I'll pin once in the middle of my ease area, and then I'll pin once more here and once more here, making sure that that ease is nice and even in each of these sections. Okay, now we'll repeat the same thing for this upper area. Okay, this one is all pinned and ready to sew. Now I'm just going to go ahead and pin the other side the same way. So when everything is pinned, it should look a little bit like this. We're now ready to sew both of these princess seams, and we'll be sewing them at 1/2 inch seam allowance, backstitching both ends. Be sure you've returned your machine's stitch length to 2.5mm or whatever is best for the weight of fabric you're using. Try to avoid sewing over any actual folds as you go, and get really close to each pin before removing it to keep the excess evenly distributed and prevent it from just sliding forward. Next, we're going to be finishing the edges of our seams and then pressing them with the iron. And there's a lot of different preferences as far as how to press and finish these types of seams. Some people prefer to press their seam allowances open on a princess seam. I actually prefer to press mine towards the center, as in both seam allowances from each seam will be pointed towards one another, towards the center of the garment. I just find that they happen to sit nicely when they're pressed in that direction, so that's what I'm going to do today. But before pressing, I want to finish off these raw edges somehow. We're going to take kind of the quick and easy way today, and I'm just going to be overlocking these raw edges. You can do the same if you have an overlock or serger, but if you don't, you can also do the same thing by just simply sewing a zigzag stitch along the edges. Since we're going to be pressing the seam allowances both in the same direction as one another as opposed to opened up, then as I go over to the overlock, I will be overlocking them together as opposed to separate from one another. Before I do so though, I want to remove some of my threads that are left behind from the 2 rows of ease stitching that we sewed over the bust area. But I'm not actually going to be removing both rows. I want to start by just removing the 5/8 of an inch stitch line. That's the one that's visible from the outside of the garment. I want to get rid of this one first, but I'm going to choose to leave the 3/8 of an inch ease stitch behind. And the reason for this is I find it actually helps in my overlocking process to have some of that excess along the side front panel still being drawn inward a little bit by those ease threads. So I'm going to leave the 3/8 line in there as I go over those raw edges with the overlock. So I'm just going to begin by removing the 5/8 of an inch thread. And I'm gonna go and just overlock right along these two seam allowance edges to serge them together and finish the edges. Then we'll finish by pressing. First, just going over the top of the seam to help the threads settle, and then by pressing the seam allowances towards the center of the garment, using a tailor's ham to keep the seam's contour. I prefer to press these from the right side of the garment, as you can really open it up and press down to the stitches without pressing any excess folds along the length of the seam. And now we can go ahead and move on to the back of the garment. Here are my back bodice pattern pieces. We have the two center backs and the two side backs, and we're basically going to be doing the exact same process that we did for our front princess seams to sew the back princess seams, which are right here. As you look at these side back panels, they could probably be a little bit confusing in terms of which one is the princess seam or which one is the side seam. So you'll want to look for the set of double notches. A set of double notches typically indicates the back of the garment. So a back princess seam will usually have a set of double notches on both of the pieces that it takes to sew that princess seam. Here's my double notches matched. Right now everything is laid out with the right side facing up, and we want to sew these two princess seams with right sides together. So we'll just take this one, flip it over, and we'll be pinning. Take this one, flip it over, and we'll be pinning. The only difference between our back princess seams and our front princess seams is the fact that we don't have to do the same ease stitching for the back as we did for the front. There's no little section of excess along the back princess seams. It's just a straight, even length seam. So I'm just going to begin by pinning the beginning and end points first, and then come to my double notches, make sure those are aligned, pin there as well. And honestly, that's probably enough pins for these simple straight seams. I'll repeat the same thing for the other side. Once you're pinned, you're just going to be sewing both of these seams with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Remember to backstitch both ends, overlock those seam allowances, and then press them towards the center of the garment, which would be towards your long center back seams right in the middle. Next, we'll be sewing the shoulder seams of our garment. Here's my front bodice, here's my back bodice. I just want to place them with right sides together, matched at the shoulder seams, and we'll pin them in place. So I'll take this side, flip it over so we're right sides together. And on the shoulder seam, the seam allowances may look a little bit funky. These are shaped seam allowances, and they're shaped at the corners in a way so that when you press the seam allowances open, which is what we'll be doing, the shape of the seam allowance will mirror the shape of that seam line that it gets folded towards. So when you're matching up and pinning the shoulder seams, you don't want to pin the actual corners of the fabric together, but instead match them where the notches are clipped, which is basically where your seam line is. So it'll look just about like this. And at the other end, we see a similar odd shape happening. So you match here and here as you pin. Once your shoulder seams are pinned, you're ready to sew them both. We'll be sewing both of these shoulder seams with 1/2 inch seam allowance, backstitching at both ends. After the seams are sewn, we're going to be pressing these seam allowances open, as opposed to how we pressed our princess seams, which were towards the center of the garment. So because of this, when we go to overlock the seam allowance edges after creating our seam, we're going to be overlocking both edges separate from one another instead of together. That will allow us to press them open and away from one another afterwards. Now, let's move on to assembling our facing. This is going to be a neckline facing that will help finish off the neckline seam of the garment. If you're sewing the collar will get sandwiched between the bodice and this facing. And if you're choosing to not sew the collar, then you simply don't sew the collar and you'll use the facing sewn against the bodice to finish the neckline. The first step for assembling the facing is to sew the shoulder seams. And these are going to be sewn exactly the same way we sewed the shoulder seams for the bodice. This is my front facing, and here's my two back facings. So I want to flip it so that we have right sides together, which means this one has to actually end up on this side, And this one, when I flip it right sides together, it ends up over here. Now I'm just going to pin the shoulder seams, matching them at the stitch line, not at the seam allowance corners, just like we did with the bodice shoulder seams. After pinning, we'll be sewing them the exact same way as the bodice shoulder seams. Sew both seams with 1/2 inch seam allowance. Overlock or zigzag both seam allowances separate from one another, and then you'll be pressing those seam allowances open on both shoulders. Now we're going to be finishing off the edges of our facing. The facing edges that we need some finishing touches on are the ones that are not going to be sewn into any other part of the garment. Those facing edges are this long curve in the front and these two shorter curves in the back. These sections between the 2 points on either side are actually going to be part of the armhole, and we do not need to do our finishing here. Now, the quick and dirty method for finishing off these edges would simply be to do an overlock or zigzag stitch along these edges. So you're totally welcome to do that if you'd like, but I want to get a little bit fancier today. So we're going to be finishing these edges with some bias binding. I'm also electing to use some contrast bias binding for this part. Granted, this is only going to be visible on the inside of the garment, so this is what we just like to call hanger appeal. We're doing this for fun so that the wearer is actually the only person that sees this cool little contrast touch. I have a section of white bias binding cut here, and I've already sort of cut this at an estimation to the overall length we need. So you'll want to do the same before you do this next process of pressing the folds out of the binding. So to estimate how much binding you'll need, just come to the sections that we designated as needing the finishing, which are here and here, and just kind of walk your bias binding along these sections. And once you've kind of estimated the amount of bias binding you need, add a little bit extra for safety. You can see I have a few inches here, and cut off of your main portion of bias to that length. Next, we're going to take this binding, which is 1/4 inch wide double fold, and first we'll open it up down the center. So you can see now there's folds on either side. Open up the center fold, and then continue to open up one of the side folds. And this is how we're going to be pressing our binding before we continue. After your binding has been pressed, we're going to lay it down against our facing, which should be facing right side up now. Lay it down like this so that we still have the one fold that we didn't press open facing up. And I want to place that still folded edge at the beginning of the first section that I'll be sewing this to. So against the right side of the facing. As we sew this, I'll be unfolding gently with my fingertips the portion that we didn't unfold, matching the edge of the binding with the edge of the facing, and stitching in the fold line that you can see. I'll stitch each section, cut the binding, and then move it to the next section in the same manner. Next, press your binding outward and away from the seam you just sewed. Then, wrap it around the edge of the facing and toward the wrong side, and press again. While many bias binding finishes involve keeping a fold on the back side as well, we're going to leave this section of the binding unfolded. It'll be pressing against the bodice from the inside, and we want it to keep a smooth, low profile so that it won't leave a visible impression from the outside of the finished garment. After pressing, sew your binding closed using the stitch in the ditch technique, which means stitch directly in the crevice of the seam, being sure that you're also catching the binding on the underside. Next, we'll move on to sewing the collar. I have my collar pieces laid out here. You should have 2 upper collars and 2 under collars. And yes, they are different shaped pieces. The upper collar is the side of the collar that's always going to be visible on the outside, and the under collar is the underlayer of the collar. The under collar is always intentionally made a little bit smaller than the upper collar to reduce the bulk that can sometimes be created from the collar coming up and rolling back down. So you should be able to tell under collar versus upper collar by simply comparing 2 of the pieces and seeing which one is smaller. So see, as I lay this one out here, I can see that there's an 1/8 of an inch offset running around the collar edge. But even aside from comparing the pieces visually, my upper collar should be the one that has the inner facing fused to the wrong side. The under collar will also typically have a double notch somewhere on it. Our collar is created as a Peter Pan collar, which is why we have 2 halves. On the back of the under collar, which is right here, here's kind of my 2 center back edges of the under collar, I've placed a double notch in the pattern. On collars that are not Peter Pan style and are just one piece wrapping all the way around, there will always be a double notch at the center back neck. And that's an industry standard cue to tell you that that is the under collar, as opposed to the upper collar typically only having a single notch at the center back neck. So even though this isn't technically the center back neck point, I decided to use that center back collar edge seam to place a double notch as another indicator for you that this is the under collar as opposed to the upper collar. Right now, all of my pieces are still right side up because that's how I laid them out. So I'll take my under collar and I'm gonna flip it so that it's right side down as I place it against the upper collar, but it doesn't go on that one, it's gonna go over on this side. So right sides together. Same thing over here. I'll flip it so I have right sides together and place it on the upper collar. To pin, since our pieces are offset, they're not the exact same shape and size, we want to purposely match up and pin the collar edge portion of it and not the neckline. This inner curve right here, this concave curve, is the neckline. This is the part that we will not be pinning and we will not have matched up. Instead, we want to match and pin the 3 remaining sides. And your piece may look a little bit kind of bubbly as you do so because you're having to yank a smaller piece over to fit a bigger piece. So I'm going to start by pinning these 2 corners at the beginning and end of the neckline. And I want my fabric matched at those corners to begin with. But now as I come down and pin the rest, I want to be pulling the under collar to match. So I'll come to this corner next and really pull your under collar to match it up with the upper collar, which is sitting on the bottom. I always like to do all my corners first with the collar pinning. Here's the collar tips. Bring those together, match them, and pin. Next, this little section of the collar edge as well. Yes, you will need to actually kind of stretch this to ease it into place and then apply either 1 or 2 more pins to this section. I'm gonna go ahead and go with 2. Keeping it stretched while you pin is gonna help the 2 pieces become a little more evenly distributed for when you sew them. Now for the long collar edge, there's a notch right here, which is meant to help with the fabric distribution along this seam line. So make sure the notches of your 2 collar pieces are matched and pin there before pinning any unnotched section. Okay, pin at the notch, and now we'll come to this area and give a little gentle stretch. As I've done this, where I've pulled everything over to match along the collar edge, you should now see the upper collar sticking out a little bit further than the under collar. So this is what we want here. Once your collars are all pinned, you're ready to sew. As we sew, we're going to be sewing around the collar edge portion with 1/4 inch seam allowance. As we do our 1/4 inch sewing, being sure to pivot at these 2 corners, there's a special little trick that I'm going to show you at the sewing machine that will help you get even sharper collar tips than you've ever had before. Begin sewing the collar edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're 1 stitch before you would pivot to the next side, stop, make sure your needle is down, and grab a piece of thread about 8 to 10 inches long. Floss the thread between the 2 layers of fabric and bump it right up against the needle. Close the fabric and take the final stitch to the pivot point, leaving your needle down again. Wrap the right-hand side of thread around the needle and pull both ends of thread between the layers of fabric to the inside of the collar. Align the next section of the collar edge to continue sewing, and repeat the same technique at the next collar tip. After sewing the seam around the collar edges, we now want to clip away a little bit of the excess at any of the points that our stitch line passes. So that's at the collar tips in the front, as well as the kind of more squared off collar tips in the back. Whenever I clip the seam allowance on the tip of a collar, I start by going straight across, almost at the point of the stitch line, but many times I find that this isn't enough fabric to remove. You can always tell if you need to remove more fabric in your clipping by taking the seam allowances and folding them inward at the stitch line and seeing if the fabric overlaps. Okay, so right here I can see that the two seam allowances are overlapping when I fold them inward. That means I'm still going to have a lot of bulk in this corner, so I want to skim away a little bit more. So after making that first initial clip that just goes straight across, I want to come from low on each side and just taper a little more of it away. Now we'll also come in and clip the excess at the back collar tips, but they probably won't require as much tapering as we did at the front. So I'll go straight across, almost to my stitch line, and then I'll just skim a little more off in both directions. The next step that we're going to be doing for our collars is understitching the collar edge. And we only really need to apply our understitching to these long portions of the collar edge right here. We're not going to turn the collar completely right side out yet. I find that it's a lot easier to do the understitching while they're still in this position. So I'm going to take both halves over to the sewing machine, and we'll be opening them up and kind of stitching from inside of this tight collar pocket we have. To do our understitching, we want to have the seam allowance of the collar edge going in the direction of the under collar, which should be the one that does not have the interfacing. Normally, I even like to press the seam allowance in that direction before doing the understitching, but this is such a tight pocket that we've created that I don't even think I can get the iron in there. So we're just gonna do our best to spread the seam open as much as we can while we understitch. To understitch, sew about 1/16 of an inch away from the seam on the side that has the seam allowances, which in this case is the under collar. I know it's a little tight, but do your best to start and finish as close to the corners as possible, even if you can't get all the way up to them, and secure both ends with a delicate back stitch of about 3 stitches or so. The next thing I'll be showing you with the collar is how to apply the 2 decorative studs to the collar tips, if you're choosing to do so, because remember, this is just an optional design choice. If you're interested in doing the studs, then you should have marked their placement with tailor tacks on the upper collar piece. I have my tailor tacks right here, and this is my upper collar facing up. As you can see, it has the interfacing on it, but I felt that it was a little tricky to see where the tailor tack was coming out of the fabric, so I went ahead and darkened those points with just a little pencil dot, just showing exactly where that thread is exiting the fabric. And believe it or not, it actually is going to be a little bit easier to apply the studs while the collars are still inside out, just like this. The reason for that is it allows us to access the prongs on the back of the stud much more easily so that we can fold them closed. So I'm going to take my stud and grab it in these tweezers, which will help me get it positioned a little bit better. And I have the prongs facing up. I'm just going to reach inside the collar and try my best to center the stud at the little dot that I've made at my tailor tack. So here we go. You can see the little prongs coming up from the stud, and I'm pretty centered on my mark. So I just want to push them through the fabric a little more. And to close the prongs, my tool of choice is actually just a straight or slotted screwdriver. I'm just going to take the tip of it and fold the prongs inward toward the center of the stud. Now this one is in place, and when we turn our collar right side out, we'll have a perfectly placed stud. as well as we won't have the little prongs coming out on the finished back side of the collar. This is why we kind of did it from the inside and are only sticking it through the upper collar rather than through all layers when the collar is totally complete. It's just going to be a cleaner finish and it will pinch the fabric a little bit less that way. Now that my studs are in place and my collar tips are clipped, we can finally take both of our collar halves and turn them right side out. I'm going to take my collar and first by hand, just turn everything outward. So there's my little stud. And now I should be able to grab these pink threads that I sewed into the collar edge seam earlier. Gently pull on them, and that should help give a nice, super sharp corner without even having to use a point turner or pencil or any additional pokey tools. See? Let's do the same thing over here. Here's my little handle. Give it a pull. Oh, look at that. Nice, super sharp collar tip. And the tailor tack that you used to indicate the stud placement can just be removed now, as well as our little collar tip handles. You can just take all of those additional threads out of the collar. And now we're ready to take our collar over to the iron and press all around the collar edge. I like to press with the under collar facing up because the goal when pressing a collar is to have the seam rolled slightly towards the under collar rather than sitting evenly on the side. The understitching we did on the longest collar edge will naturally aid in this, but on the shorter edges, you'll want to help it along by pressing those seam allowances toward the under collar first, and then rolling the seam a little further around while pressing over the top of everything. Next, we just want to do a little stay stitch along the neckline portion of our collar pieces. We're doing this because now at the neckline is where we should see this small little offset created by the fact that the two collar pieces were different sizes. So we want to pull that under collar edge over to meet the upper collar edge, just like this. It will look like it's bubbling a little bit, but again, we want this because it will give us a better collar roll in the end. So I just want to match up the edges of the two pieces along the neckline. We'll pin it in place. Now that we're pinned, we're ready to do our stay stitch. And for stay stitching, we really just want to sew about 1/8 of an inch away from the neckline edge. It's just to help hold the two layers together because it'll make it a lot easier to sew this onto the bodice in the next step if we don't have two edges struggling to stay aligned. This concludes part 1 of our sewing tutorial. To continue, just jump on over to the part 2 video. See you there.